Hello, and welcome. Whether you're listening late at night with slow, steady breaths, or resting during a peaceful moment of your day, this gentle journey invites you to drift quietly into the past. Find a soft place to settle. Let your body grow heavy, your thoughts unhurried. Together, we are traveling back centuries, across warm seas and rustling palm groves, to a world marked by beauty, but also by immense hardship. This is You Wouldn't Last a Day in a Colonial Caribbean Plantation, a calm, reflective exploration of the lives of enslaved people who endured conditions far beyond what most of us can imagine. Take a deep breath in. As you exhale, picture the first light of dawn spreading over wide fields of sugarcane, their tall green stalks swaying gently in a morning breeze. Hear the distant rhythm of waves brushing against the shore, steady and soft. In this peaceful retelling, we step away from violence and look instead at the quiet resilience, the exhausting labor, the weight of the climate, and the strength of the human spirit. We walk slowly and with respect, observing the world in which generations lived, worked, and survived under unimaginable pressures. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a plantation just as the sun rises. The air is warm, thick with the scent of cane, earth, and salt carried from the sea. The landscape is beautiful, lush hillsides, bright skies, and the shimmer of sunlight on leaves. But beneath this beauty lies a story of endurance. You may be lying in bed or relaxing at home now, but a part of you can almost feel the heavy Caribbean heat, the kind that settles on the skin and never quite lifts. Let the day's worries melt away as we step into this quiet reflection on lives shaped by labor, heat, and struggle. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore the hidden realities of plantation life, how the intense tropical sun tested the body, how long hours in the fields wore down strength day after day, and how harsh conditions affected health, spirit, and life expectancy. We'll listen to the soft sounds of night inside small cabins, observe the slow movements of workers preparing for another day, and feel the weight of the environment that shaped every moment of life in the Caribbean colonies. Through it all, we'll move at a gentle, respectful pace, letting each scene unfold like a distant memory carried on warm winds. Now that you're comfortable and calm, let's begin this reflective journey through history. Our first chapter starts with the land itself, the shimmering fields, the humid air, and the daily rhythms that defined life on a plantation. Settle in, breathe deeply, and allow the quiet images of the past to guide you. And if you find this peaceful exploration meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can join many more calm journeys into history. Chapter 1: A World of Heat and Toil. In the colonial Caribbean of the 18th century, sugar was king. The warm tropical islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint-Domingue were blanketed with vast sugarcane plantations, all geared towards producing the white gold of sugar for European markets. Between the 1600s and 1800s, millions of Africans were transported across the Atlantic to these islands, forming the enslaved workforce that fueled the sugar empires. The lush beauty of the islands was thus shadowed by unimaginable cruelty, the paradise landscape masking a living hell for those in bondage. These plantations were hot, humid, and relentless environments, places where the sun beat down mercilessly and the air hung heavy with heat. European planters believed that Africans could somehow withstand this tropical climate better than Europeans, a cruel justification they used for relying on enslaved African labor. In truth, No human being was naturally suited to endure such conditions of unbearable heat and grueling labor day in and day out. By the mid-1700s, Caribbean sugar colonies had become the most valuable possessions of European empires. Jamaica, with its huge sugar estates and brutal slave regime, was considered the jewel in the imperial crown of the British Empire. But behind the great wealth and sweet luxury of sugar lay the suffering of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. They had been torn from their homelands and shipped across the Atlantic, only to be condemned to a life of misery and toil on these islands. Many did not survive the infamous Middle Passage across the ocean. Those who did were sold at auction to plantation owners and forced into a brutal new life. Often families were torn apart in the sale, husbands separated from wives, parents from children. This was the starting point of a living nightmare that would unfold under the Caribbean sun. On a sugar plantation, enslaved people had to perform every task needed to grow and process sugar. Unlike in Europe, where a farmer might grow a crop and send it elsewhere for processing, here the plantation was both farm and factory. Enslaved men, women, and even children planted the cane, tended it, harvested it, and then labored to extract the juice and boil it into sugar. They also distilled molasses into rum, making use of every byproduct. Year-round, from one end of the calendar to the other, their work never let up. There was no true off-season on a sugar estate, only different phases of labor, each demanding in its own way. From dawn until dusk, and often through the night in peak harvest time, the enslaved workforce toiled under conditions that would break the average person. The work in the fields was truly grueling, with long hours under the blazing hot sun, supervised by overseers quick to crack the whip. Tasks ranged from clearing new land of trees and rocks to digging planting holes, weeding cane fields, cutting down the tall canes at harvest, and hauling heavy loads of cane stalks. Every chore was backbreaking. Inside the sugar works, the mill where cane was crushed, and the boiling house where juice was rendered into syrup, conditions could be even worse. The heat from furnaces and boiling syrup was sweltering, and accidents were an ever-present risk. Enslaved Africans faced long hours, intense heat, and constant danger, all while knowing that any sign of slowing down could invite violent punishment. The mortality on these plantations was shockingly high. Overwork, poor nutrition, tropical diseases, brutal punishments, and unsanitary living conditions all took their toll. Planters were aware that the harsh regimen they imposed shortened their slaves' lives dramatically. In fact, many plantation owners found it more economical to literally work people to death and import new slaves, rather than improve conditions for the ones they had. Until laws like the British Amelioration Act of 1798 pressured them to make minimal reforms. Most slave owners simply replaced the dead with fresh captives from Africa. This means that for decades, the plantations devoured human lives at an appalling rate. It is within this world of scorching heat, ceaseless labor, and institutionalized cruelty that we set our scene. Imagine a typical sugar plantation on a Caribbean island around the year 1800. Rows of tall green sugarcane stretch into the distance under a shimmering sky. The white planter's great house sits on a hill, shaded by trees, while below lie the clusters of enslaved people's huts near the fields. A windmill or water wheel creaks as it turns the rollers of the sugar mill. The air carries the sweet, heavy scent of molasses mixed with wood smoke from the boiling house. It is early morning, and the sun is just beginning to glow red on the horizon. In the slave village, people are already stirring. A new day of labor and hardship is about to begin, and it will test the limits of human endurance. No ordinary person, certainly no modern person accustomed to comfort, could last even a single day under these circumstances without being utterly overwhelmed. As we follow the rhythm of a typical day on this plantation, keep in mind the sheer strength and resilience it took for enslaved people to survive even briefly in this environment. The phrase, "you wouldn't last a day," is not just a figure of speech here, it is a literal truth. Chapter 2. Before Dawn. Waking to another day. The day effectively begins well before the sun. While the sky is still dark and filled with stars, a horn sounds from near the overseer's quarters, a long, droning bellow that carries through the humid pre-dawn air. In the small wattle and darb huts of the slave quarters, people awaken at this signal. They rise from crude bedding of old blankets or piles of straw on earthen floors. There is no luxury of sleeping in, no gentle sunrise awakening. The schedule is dictated by the plantation's needs and the overseer's horn. In one hut, a young man of maybe 20 years, we'll call him Samuel, sits up and instinctively reaches to soothe his aching back. Even in the dim light, old scars from the whip crisscross his dark skin, reminders of past punishments. He blinks away fatigue. The previous day's work only ended a few hours ago for him, and his body has not fully recovered during the short night. Around him, other family members or bunkmates are also stirring. An older man coughs deeply, a wet, rattling cough that has been getting worse, perhaps a sign of consumption or some other illness. A woman gently hushes an infant who had been nursing at her breast. The baby fusses, not fully satisfied. Its mother's milk has been scant, likely because the mother herself is underfed and exhausted. There is little time for tender moments, however. Everyone knows they must be ready when the overseer expects them in the yard, or else face his wrath. In the darkness, they quickly prepare for the day. They slip into the rough linen or Osnaburg cloth garments that serve as their work clothes. Simple shirts and trousers for the men, coarse dresses for the women. Most adults have only one set of clothing to their name, already patched and threadbare from hard use. Children, until they reach the early teens, often go naked or near naked, especially in the hot weather. If they are lucky, there might be a few minutes to eat a little something before work. Over a small fire outside the huts, someone reheats a pot of last night's cornmeal porridge or roasted breadfruit. The ration given by the plantation, perhaps some salted fish and a handful of maize meal or sweet potatoes for the day, is meager. Enslaved families do their best to supplement it with what they grow in their own gardens or forage. This morning, Samuel chews slowly on a cold boiled yam left over from Sunday's cooking. It's starchy, but at least fills his stomach a bit. He shares a portion with his younger sister, who is around 10 years old and already expected to work alongside the adults in lighter tasks like weeding or carrying water. In the pre-dawn gloom, there is a brief moment of quiet as people eat and mentally brace themselves. Some might murmur a prayer or recall a snatch of a song from home. In low voices, they encourage their children to be strong, to keep up. Perhaps a mother quickly ties a cloth around her hair, steeling herself for another long day. A father gives his son a reassuring pat on the shoulder. They all know what is coming. They have lived this routine countless times, yet each day remains an ordeal anew. Soon, The second horn, or a loud shout from the overseer's assistant, often an enslaved driver, acting on the overseer's orders, pierces the air. It's time. In the grey dawn light, the enslaved workers shuffle out of their village and assemble, usually near the tool shed or some central yard. Here, they receive their assignments for the day. The overseer, a white man with a broad-brimmed hat and a permanent scowl, sits on horseback or stands with a whip in hand, already barking orders. Around him are a couple of drivers, enslaved men, promoted to enforce work, each carrying a whip or a switch. These drivers are themselves slaves, but they have been given authority and small privileges to make others work harder. They walk a thin line, hated by some of their fellows for their cruelty, yet pressured by the overseer to extract as much labor as possible. In a stern voice, the overseer might assign, for example, first gang to the new cane field by the river, cane holing and planting today. Second gang to weeding in the old field. Third gang, you tend the trash fire and carry water. The first gang, consisting of the strongest men and women, often in their prime teens, 20s or early 30s, is given the hardest tasks. The second gang, made up of slightly older or less able-bodied slaves, does somewhat lighter but still strenuous work. The third gang, sometimes called the grass gang, includes the elderly and the youngest children. They do things like pulling weeds, cleaning up dry cane leaves, trash, and scaring birds or catching rats that might harm the crops. This hierarchy reflects a brutal reality. By the time a person reaches their 40s, if they have survived at all, their body is often so broken by labor that they can no longer keep up with the younger field workers. At around 40, an enslaved worker is considered old and is shifted to lighter duties if possible, alongside children who are not yet fully strong, all part of the third gang. As assignments are shouted, everyone moves quickly to gather the tools needed: heavy iron hoes, machetes, billhooks, shovels, baskets, and so on. The tools are often blunt or worn from constant use, but they must serve. Samuel shoulders his hoe and joins the first gang, trudging toward the new field. His little sister trots off with the third gang, carrying a woven basket almost as big as her, which she'll use to collect weeds or maybe dung for manure. The sun is just peeking above the horizon now, an orange glow that hints at the heat to come. The air is thick and already warm, with night's coolness rapidly lifting. They walk out to the fields in silence or low murmurs. Talking loudly or laughing is not encouraged. An overseer might interpret it as lack of seriousness, or even a passus, prelude to some conspiracy. Many enslaved people have learned to maintain an outward expression of neutrality or submissiveness in front of the overseers, an outward demeanor of dutiful subordination, as one historian noted. In their hearts, they may feel anger or despair, but on the surface, they appear docile, avoiding eye contact, moving steadily to their places. The ever-present threat of the whip ensures this behavior. Everyone can hear the occasional crack of a whip in the distance, as drivers herd stragglers or chastise someone who didn't move fast enough. That sharp crack of the whip was a constant sound in plantation life, an audible reminder that their lives and bodies were not their own. Now, under the early morning sky, the gangs reach their designated spots. The first gang, including Samuel, fans out in long rows on the plot of land that has been cleared for planting new cane. It's dawn, and a faint golden light touches the dew on the grass. For a brief, The landscape almost looks peaceful, green and gold, with palm trees silhouetted in the distance. But this illusion of peace is quickly shattered by the bark of a driver. Begin work. The day's labor has officially commenced. Chapter 3. Toiling in the cane fields. Almost immediately, the enormous difficulty of the work makes itself felt. Today, Samuel and the first gang have been assigned to cane holing, preparing the fields for planting young sugarcane. This is some of the hardest manual labor on the plantation, and 1,823 illustration of enslaved people planting sugarcane, digging cane holes on an Antigua estate. They mark out a grid and dig deep holes with hoes, about 6 to 9 inches deep and several feet across, working bent over in the hot sun. A driver with a whip stands by, far right, supervising the gang. This image portrays how cane holing was an arduous, back-breaking process, requiring the strongest workers. The first gang slaves spread out across the field, each assigned a patch of ground. Under the supervisor's plan, they must dig a grid of holes across the entire plot, using only hoes, heavy, broad-bladed hoes with long wooden handles. They must gouge out square pits in the soil, each pit about 4 to 6 feet wide and perhaps 6 to 9 inches deep. The earth is sun-baked and hard in places, tangled with roots in others. With every swing of the hoe, clods of dirt, fly, and mussels strain. Samuel drives his hoe into the ground with practiced skill. He has done this many times and knows how to leverage his weight to break the soil. Still, after just a few minutes, sweat is beading on his forehead and arms. The Caribbean sun climbs quickly, and even though it's still morning, the heat begins to intensify. All around, the men and women of the first gang bend and heave in a steady rhythm. The work is literally back-breaking. They must bend low and lift out heavy soil for hours on end. A strong first gang worker might be expected to dig 60 to 100 such holes in a single day, moving by hand as much as 1,500 cubic feet of earth in the process. It is an almost unimaginable volume, equivalent to a large mound of earth, moved one hoe scoop at a time, basket by basket. The removed soil is piled up as a ridge between the holes, forming a pattern of low banks. This will help channel water to the cane roots later, but for now, it means each hole must be neatly excavated and the dirt thrown up around it. There are no plows or mechanized tools to do this. It is all done by human hands and human strength. Only the strongest and fittest slaves are put on cane holing, because it demands endless stamina and force. Even so, after an hour or two of this work, arms tremble with fatigue and lower backs ache fiercely. As they labor, the sun climbs higher, pouring heat onto the exposed field. There are few trees here to provide shade. Most have been cleared to maximize planting space. The humidity makes the air thick. Sweat soaks through the coarse linens that the slaves wear and trickles in their eyes. They dare not stop or pause for long. An overseer on horseback watches from a slight distance, and the drivers walk among the laborers, urging them on. If someone slows down too much, straightens up to rest a moment, they risk a lash across the shoulders. A driver might shout, "Keep on! Faster!" accompanied by the snap of a whip in the air as a warning. In some cases, they don't bother with warning. A lagging worker might feel the sudden burning cut of leather across their back, the driver's way of telling them to pick up the pace. The overseer's whip and the driver's whip are never far from anyone's mind. They form a background terror that pushes people beyond normal human limits. Under this coercion, the first gang maintains a steady, grueling tempo. chop, lift, throw, chop, lift, throw. The only sounds are the thunk of metal into earth, heavy breathing, occasional grunts of effort, and the calls of the drivers. Already, some laborers' hands have developed blisters under the friction of the hoe handle. Even if they had calluses, cane holing can wear them raw again. A woman in the gang works beside Samuel. She is perhaps in her late 20s. Her face is slick with sweat, her arms muscular from years of this toil. She doesn't speak, just concentrates on each swing, but her breath comes in labored gasps. Samuel glances over and notices she seems a bit faint. He can do nothing to help her, except perhaps take 1 or 2 extra swings of his hoe to cover a bit of her section when the driver isn't looking. Many enslaved people quietly helped each other like this when possible, sharing the burden surreptitiously to survive. But such acts of solidarity are risky. If the overseer catches someone covering for another, he might accuse them of slacking or not minding their own task. After a couple of hours of cane holing, the pits are starting to take shape across the field. Now comes another unpleasant task: manuring. The plantation has prepared heaps of manure, rotting animal dung, likely from livestock pens mixed with cane trash. Enslaved workers must carry this foul-smelling fertilizer to each hole. Large baskets of manure, weighing up to 80 pounds each, are filled to the brim. 2 people lift a basket up and set it on a carrier's head. Often, it is the women of the second gang or the stout younger members of the first gang who become human pack animals for this job. They walk, basket on head, to each raw hole and dump some manure in to enrich the soil for the cane plant. It is hard, disgusting work that everybody hates. Flies buzz around the manure piles, and the stench is overwhelming under the hot sun. But it must be done. The cane needs fertile soil to grow tall and thick. Samuel experiences a wave of nausea as he shoulders a basket of dung with a partner and proceeds to a row of holes. The smell is putrid. He has to breathe through his mouth to avoid gagging. Flies cling to his sweaty skin. By now, the morning is well advanced, perhaps around 9 or 10 o'clock, and the temperature keeps rising. The sun overhead is brilliant and mercilessly hot. There is no relief, except when an occasional cloud passes. The workers' clothing is now drenched in sweat and smeared with dirt and manure. Their muscles scream for rest, but still they carry on, hole after hole. Elsewhere on the plantation, the second gang might be engaged in a different but equally exhausting task. For example, they could be weeding the older cane fields. In the Caribbean climate, weeds spring up rapidly and, if left unchecked, will choke the young cane plants. So even as new cane is being planted on one plot, other enslaved people are moving through the tall, half-grown cane in another field, pulling weeds by hand or with small knives. This work can be torturous in its own way. They are often in a stooped position all day, moving among cane that sometimes towers overhead, which creates a greenhouse-like effect, stiflingly hot and humid. In those dense rows, breezes rarely penetrate, and the sun heats the air trapped by the cane. In addition, there are pests to contend with, clouds of mosquitoes or swarms of vicious biting ants that nest around cane roots. The workers' arms and legs might be covered in insect bites and cuts from the sharp-edged cane leaves. Sugar cane leaves can slice like paper. Younger children in the third gang often accompany the weeding crews to pick up the pulled weeds into baskets and to hunt the many rats that infest the fields. Killing rats is actually important. Rats love to gnaw on sweet young cane and can ruin a crop. Plantation owners sometimes even offered small rewards, maybe an extra bit of food or a coin, to those who caught the most rats. No matter the specific task, digging, manuring, weeding, or clearing, the pattern is the same. Continuous, back-breaking labor under a tropical sun. By late morning, many of the slaves are nearing exhaustion, but they force themselves to keep going. They know that if they falter, the overseer or driver will not hesitate to inflict pain. The lash is a cruel master, driving them beyond what their bodies would otherwise bear. Under this regime, they achieve feats of labor that, under any humane circumstances, would be utterly unthinkable. An observer might be astonished to see how much ground is cleared, how many holes dug or acres weeded by just a few dozen people in a short span. But that productivity is squeezed out of them by violence and fear, rather than any fair incentive. Perhaps a few silently hum a work song under their breath, a slow, repetitive melody that helps keep a rhythm. In some places, slaves were allowed or even encouraged to sing softly as they worked, because it could ironically make them more productive, or at least keep their spirits from utterly collapsing. The songs might be in an African language or a Creole, often with double meanings, expressing sorrow or hope in a way the overseers can't easily understand. For example, a chorus about going home might sound like a simple tune to an English ear, but to the enslaved it could be a coded longing for freedom or return to Africa. In this way, even while their bodies are chained to the soil, their minds and culture find tiny spaces of resistance and relief. At some point around midday, there is usually a short break. The tropical sun is near its zenith, and even the overseer recognizes that if he doesn't allow a pause, the gang might collapse from heat stroke. Perhaps a bell is rung, or the overseer simply calls for a halt. The enslaved workers drop their tools and seek any scrap of shade they can find at the edges of the field, maybe under a hedgerow or the slender shadow of a cart. Many just sink to the ground where they stood, their chests heaving. The heat is oppressive, shimmering off the ground. There is no luxury of a leisurely siesta, but maybe they get half an hour to eat a midday meal and recover some strength. From a large iron pot, brought out to the fields, often carried by an older slave or cook, each person receives their rationed lunch. It might be a ladle of thin cornmeal porridge or cassava mush, perhaps with a few beans. Simple fare to fuel the afternoon's work. If they're lucky, there could be a bit of salted fish or meat to give it flavor. Often, though, the midday meal is very light, almost just a gruel. They eat quickly. Thirst is a huge problem. By noon, each person has lost a lot of water through sweat. There may be a water barrel or bucket in the field. A couple of enslaved boys or girls have the job of water carrier, bringing water to the field and ladling it out to the workers. The water is warm under the sun and not particularly clean, but they gulp it down greedily. Some relief washes through their bodies as they hydrate and rest their limbs for a moment. Samuel pours a dipper of water over his head and lets it run down his face and body, washing off some sweat and cooling him briefly. His muscles ache as he sits on the ground, chewing a bite of cassava bread. Around him, the others are similarly trying to recover. A few exchange quiet words in their African mother tongues or in the Creole dialect that has developed on the plantation, comforting or encouraging one another to push through the rest of the day. Perhaps an older man, with scars on his face that suggest he survived many hardships, murmurs a proverb about endurance. A young woman closes her eyes and imagines, just for a minute, being free or back home with her family. Then, with a sad sigh, she opens them because the present reality allows no such escape. This brief respite ends all too soon. The overseer orders everyone back to work. The sun has begun its slow tilt to the west, but the afternoon will remain brutally hot for several more hours. Muscles that had stiffened during the short break protest as the slaves force themselves upright and resume their labor. If cane holing was the morning's task, it continues into the afternoon until the required number of holes is dug, manured. Sometimes, an overseer sets a fixed quota. For example, each first gang worker might be expected to finish perhaps 80 holes in total for the day. These quotas are often terribly high. To meet them, many slaves know they'll have to work not just through the afternoon, but possibly after sunset by moonlight, or finish at first light the next day. The pressure is intense. Those who fail to meet the target might be whipped in the evening for laziness, so they redouble their efforts as best as their tired bodies can, fueled by a mix of fear and determination to survive. The afternoon drags on relentlessly. Time seems to blur in the haze of heat and fatigue. The enslaved workers move almost like automatons, performing the same motions again and again. Their skin is hot to the touch, their heartbeats pounding. Some begin to suffer the early signs of heat exhaustion, dizziness, extreme thirst, cramps in the legs or arms. One young man staggers for a moment, and a driver rushes over, not with concern, but with threats. "You there, get back in line." A lash across the man's shoulders straightens him up with a cry of pain. He continues working, though his vision blurs with tears and sweat. He knows that collapsing outright could be even worse. The overseer might interpret it as malingering if he doesn't believe the slave is truly ill. It wouldn't be unheard of for someone to be whipped for faking sickness, even if they were in genuine distress. Yet, collapses do happen. Every now and then, an enslaved person simply cannot push any further and falls. When that occurs, the overseer might reluctantly allow them to be carried aside, or he might administer a cruel revival in the form of a few buckets of water dumped over them and a series of lashes to motivate them back onto their feet. On some plantations, people who collapsed from heat or fatigue were later punished for it as a lesson to others. The level of harshness varied, but in general, compassion was rare, and so the afternoon in the cane fields grinds on. Sunlight beats down on rows of bent backs. The green cane leaves rustle in a slight breeze that barely cools anyone, and the smell of earth, sweat, and manure saturates the air. The slaves continue their labor, driven by the knowledge that stopping is not an option. They have already been working since dawn, and they will likely continue until dusk or beyond. Each minute feels elongated by suffering, and yet, for their own sanity, many try to numb themselves to the passage of time, focusing narrowly on each swing of the hoe or each bundle of weeds tossed aside. In a tragic adaptation, they train themselves not to think too much about the pain or the exhaustion, because to dwell on it might lead to despair. Perhaps a few silently hum a work tune or spiritual under their breath. If any sound escapes their lips, it's low and blends with the rustling cane. There is a certain calm in their rhythm, now. Not a pleasant calm, but the dull calm of exhaustion and resignation. They know they must reserve their energy to make it to day's end. The sun begins to sink lower in the sky at long last, the fiercest heat abating slightly. Shadows of the cane rows grow longer on the ground. Though their bodies are near breaking, Many enslaved workers take a grim solace that the workday is in its final phase. If they can just hold on a little longer, they might survive this day and gain the right to collapse into what rest the night offers. Chapter 4. Harvest Time. Cutting and crushing cane. Thus far we have described a day of planting season work, cane holing, weeding, and similar tasks. Equally punishing, if not more so, is the harvest season, known as crop time, which typically comes in the dry season, for example, February to April in many islands. During harvest, the entire rhythm of plantation life shifts into an even higher gear. The reason is simple. Once sugarcane is cut, the juice inside begins to spoil very quickly in the tropical heat. To obtain good sugar, the cane must be processed, crushed, and boiled, ideally within 24 hours of cutting. This creates an urgent, around-the-clock scramble. When the cane fields are ripe and tall, often well above head height, the order comes down to cut the cane. Enslaved men and women of the first and second gangs take up their bills or cutlasses, which are sharp, curved, machete-like knives. They spread out through the rustling sea of cane stalks. Each stalk is like a thick bamboo, fibrous and juicy, about 2 to 3 inches in diameter and 6 to 10 feet tall. The leaves at the top are long, blade-like, and razor-sharp at the edges. So many cutters end up with small cuts on their faces, arms, and hands from the foliage. Some tie rags around their arms or wear crude mitts, but protection is limited in this heat. Now begins the frantic harvest work. With swift, practiced swings of their blades, the cutters slice through the base of each cane stalk, usually about 6 inches above the ground. It takes strength and precision. The cane is tough, and the cut must be clean. They then immediately hack off the feathery green top of the cane and strip away a few leaves, leaving just the thick, juicy stalk. Working in pairs or small teams, they then gather the stalks into bundles. Second gang workers follow behind the lead cutters, tying the cane into bundles using strips of leaf or vine, and heaving these bundles onto wagons or carts. From dawn until nightfall, the cane cutters bend, swing blades, and lift heavy bundles of cane, performing a motion that brutally taxes the lower back and shoulders. The speed is remarkable. In a well-organized estate, a team of enslaved cutters can clear an entire acre of cane in a day, which might be on the order of 30 to 50 tons of cane cut by hand. Each individual might cut and haul nearly a ton of cane in a single day under ideal conditions, a testament to how hard they were pushed. At harvest time, there is no real rest until all the cane is in. The first gang and second gang are typically divided into shifts to keep the work going 24 hours a day. One group works from morning until dusk, and another group takes over and works all through the night by torchlight or moonlight. They swap in rotation, so that effectively, every enslaved person in those gangs is working a 12-hour shift without pause, then grabbing a few hours of sleep, then working another 12 hours, and so on. This grueling cycle can continue for weeks during peak harvest. As one historical source notes, on large plantations, the mill and boiling house ran round the clock, 24 hours a day, 6 days a week during harvest. Picture a harvest afternoon. The sun is setting in fiery colors, but the fields are still alive with activity. Dozens of slaves move through the tall cane with their blades, the swish and thud of their cutting echoing. Smoke starts to rise in the distance from the boiling house chimneys. a sign that the first batches of cane are already being boiled into syrup. Oxen or mules strain to pull wagons overloaded with cane stalks along the dirt tracks from field to mill. Young enslaved women and elderly slaves did much of the work of loading and transporting cane bundles. Enslaved laborers bring bundled sugarcane to a windmill-powered cane crusher in this 1823 scene from Antigua. Young women and older slaves carry cane bundles on their heads to the mill, while men feed the stalks between the crushing rollers. The extracted juice flowed through troughs to the boiling house, and the crushed cane fiber was dried to use as fuel. This illustration highlights the teamwork and strenuous effort required at the mill yard during harvest. Bundles of sugarcane are unloaded from carts at the sugar mill, which might be powered by wind, with large sails turning the rollers, or by animals like oxen pulling in circles to rotate the crushing cylinders. Enslaved workers are feeding the cane into the mill's rollers. Typically, 2 or 3 strong men stand at the mill. One inserts the lengths of cane between the rollers. On the other side, another catches the partly crushed cane and feeds it back in for a second pressing, extracting every drop of juice. This job is perilous. The rollers are powerful and unyielding. If a person's hand or fingers get caught, there is almost no time to react. Exhausted from hours of work, a slave might lose concentration for a split second and fail to let go of the cane at the right moment. When that happens, the cane, and the hand holding it, is drawn into the machinery. With a terrible crunch, bones can be shattered. There is no mechanism to stop the mill quickly. Instead, a gruesome emergency procedure is employed. A nearby axe is grabbed and, without hesitation, used to chop off the trapped limb to free the person from the rollers. The historical record notes bluntly that some plantations ended up with one-armed men, bearing the results of such accidents. Imagine the screams and commotion on the floor of the mill when such a mishap occurs. Fellow slaves rush to pull the injured person away, while an overseer might angrily curse about the lost time. There is rarely proper medical care, maybe a hurried tourniquet, and then the person is just left to the mercy of a local healer or to fate. For that individual, it means permanent disability, and ironically, likely being assigned to the third gang thereafter, if they survive the blood loss and infection. Yet, even such horrific accidents do not slow the overall pace. The mill keeps turning. Others take up the work, stepping over bloodstains perhaps, determined not to meet the same fate. The cane juice, which flows out from the rollers into waiting troughs, must keep flowing. Voltaire, the French philosopher, once chillingly illustrated this reality in his satire, Candide. In one famous scene, the character Candide encounters an enslaved man on a sugar plantation who is missing a hand and a leg. The man explains, "It is at this price that you eat sugar in Europe." His master cut off his hand after he caught a finger in the mill, and cut off his leg when he tried to run away. This fictional vignette reflected real practices. The loss of limb was both a byproduct of dangerous work and a form of punishment for disobedience. The double meaning was clear. Europe's sweet tooth was paid for by the literal blood and body parts of enslaved Africans. Back in the mill yard, once the cane is crushed and the juice drained off, the leftover cane fiber, bagasse, is removed. Women and older slaves gather it and lay it out to dry, as noted in the illustration. Later it will be fed into the furnaces as fuel, an early form of reuse, though achieved by relentless labor. The juice, however, is the focus now. It travels through wooden or metal conduits from the mill to the boiling house nearby. Inside the boiling house, the scene is hellish. It is evening, and full darkness has fallen outside. Inside the long shed-like boiling house, it is sweltering, lit by the orange glow of furnaces. A series of big copper kettles or cauldrons, called the coppers, are set in a row within a brick furnace structure. The freshly squeezed cane juice flows into the first and largest cauldron. Fires roar underneath, fed by bagasse and wood, heating the juice to a boil. The juice is thin and greenish at first, full of impurities. As it boils, a dirty froth rises, which skilled workers skim off with large perforated ladles. Then the partially clarified juice is ladled or channeled into the next kettle, where the process continues, boiling it further. Typically, there might be 4 or 5 kettles in sequence, each slightly smaller than the previous, each one further concentrating the syrup. By the last kettle, the once watery cane juice has turned into a thick, dark syrup, basically molasses, and is near the point of crystallizing into raw sugar. At the right moment, the head boiler, the most senior enslaved craftsman in the boiling house, judges that the syrup is ready. At his signal, the fire is damped, and the hot liquid is quickly transferred to cooling troughs, or flat pans, where sugar crystals will form as it cools. Working in the boiling house is extremely demanding and specialized. It is also unbelievably hot and dangerous. The entire space is filled with thick, sweet-smelling steam. The heat from multiple open boiling vats is like that of a sauna. Imagine working in a closed kitchen with several cauldrons boiling furiously over open flames in a tropical climate to begin with. Enslaved workers in the boiling house drip with sweat. They often wear little more than loincloths or have their thin garments completely soaked through. They must constantly mind the syrup, stir with long paddles, and be careful not to get splashed. Boiling sugar juice can cause terrible burns. If someone slips on the wet floor or gets bumped and their arm plunges into a kettle, they will be scalded instantly. Such burns, in an era with no antibiotics, can easily turn septic and fatal. Yet the pace of work allows scant caution. They hustle from one kettle to the next, skimming and transferring liquid according to a strict timing. All the while, huge fires are maintained just below, adding smoke and cinders to the already stifling environment. The boiling house is often regarded as the most dreadful place of work on the plantation. Some said it was like the mouth of hell, both in appearance and the suffering it inflicted. Despite these conditions, the boiling and curing of sugar is a skilled process, and planters relied on the expertise of certain enslaved individuals, known as boilers. These men, and sometimes women assistants, had to know exactly when the syrup was ready and how to manage the temperatures. They held a position of relative pride among the enslaved workforce because their skill was vital to the plantation's profits. This small status difference, however, did not spare them the hardships. They might get slightly better food or a better hut as an incentive to keep them healthy, but in the boiling house they worked through the night just like everyone else during harvest. If the batch of sugar was poor quality, the boiler could even face punishment for ruining it, though often the fault might lie with weather or the cane itself. Now, stepping back from this specific night, we should understand the bigger picture of harvest season. It is the culmination of all the year's toil, and it is when enslaved people were often pushed to their absolute limit. The climate adds to their misery. These months can be extremely hot and dry. The continuous work with sharp tools and dangerous machinery results in many injuries. Sleep deprivation is common. People become clumsy and more prone to accidents, which then invites punishment if the overseer sees an injury as a mistake. Yet, in the eyes of the plantation owners, this intense period is justified by the profits rolling in. Barrels of sugar and casks of rum accumulate, ready to be shipped to Europe. Each barrel represents an almost inconceivable amount of human suffering, compressed into a commodity. It is no exaggeration to say that an enslaved person, unaccustomed to such conditions, would likely collapse or perish in a single day of harvest labor. Modern people, in particular, who live relatively comfortable lives, could hardly handle even an hour or two of swinging a machete under the noon sun, let alone 12 hours, nor stay awake for 36 hours, tending fires and carrying heavy loads. The title of our story, You Wouldn't Last a Day, rings especially true when one contemplates harvest time. Many enslaved people themselves barely lasted. They emerged from the harvest season battered and weakened. Some did not survive it at all, succumbing to exhaustion or untreated infections or heat stroke. For them, the prediction that they wouldn't last is tragically literal. Illustration 1823 of enslaved laborers cutting sugarcane in Antigua. Under the supervision of a driver on horseback, foreground, men and women use sharp billhooks to harvest tall cane stalks by hand. They then strip the leaves and pile the cane for transport to the mill. Such scenes were a daily reality during the sugar harvest, with enslaved workers enduring extreme heat and exhaustion in the fields. Once the harvest season's peak has passed, there may be a slight easing in the pace of work. The 24-hour shifts scale back, and life returns to the more normal, grueling routine of daylight hours, as described earlier. But the aftermath of harvest often leaves the enslaved population in worse health. Many have lost weight due to overwork and lack of sleep. Some are nursing injuries or deep fatigue. And yet, there is hardly any recuperation time. The cycle of planting begins anew, or the fields need cleaning and replanting. On a Caribbean sugar plantation, there was always more work to be done. More cane to cut, more land to clear, more barrels to fill. The machine of sugar production was merciless and unending, much like the sun that rose and set without pity on the laboring throngs. And 1823 aquatint shows the infernal interior of a boiling house on a sugar plantation. Enslaved workers, drenched in sweat, tend a row of boiling kettles over blazing furnaces, skimming and stirring the cane. Juice as clouds of steam billow around them. The heat is intense and unrelenting. A head boiler, enslaved master sugar maker, carefully monitors the syrup's concentration, ready to direct its transfer from one copper pot to the next at the precise moment. The boiling house demanded both skill and the ability to withstand extreme conditions. Chapter 5: Punishment and Fear. Life on a Caribbean sugar plantation was controlled not only by exhausting work and harsh conditions, but also by a regime of constant terror and punishment. The planters and overseers maintained their authority through sheer brutality. Every enslaved person knew that any act of defiance, any slowdown in work, even an accident or a perceived insolence, could result in severe punishment. This pervasive fear was the third pillar, alongside heat and labor, of their unbearable existence. The most ubiquitous instrument of punishment was the whip, typically made of plaited cowhide or some similarly tough leather. The whip could inflict terrible pain and injury. It was not merely a tool to inflict punishment after an offense. It was a day-to-day tool of motivation. Overseers and enslaved drivers carried whips as they oversaw the gangs in the fields. A crack of the whip over the heads of workers or across a laggard's back served to keep everyone moving. The continual crack of the whip was practically synonymous with plantation life, an audible threat, ever reminding enslaved people to keep their heads down and work. Under these conditions, people labored not only under the sun's heat, but under the lash's shadow. For minor infractions or failures to meet an overseer's unreasonable demands, whipping was the common punishment. A person could be tied to a post or a tree, their back bared, and lashed a set number of times, 10, 20, 50, sometimes even more. The leather biting into skin would leave horrific welts, cut the skin open, and often the wounds became infected in the tropical climate. It was not uncommon to see enslaved people with backs cross-hatched by old scars, a permanent record of past floggings. These scars were so common that they were noted in sale advertisements. A runaway's description might include, "has whip marks on his back," as virtually all did. The pain of a whipping was excruciating, but even worse could be the knowledge that it might happen again at any time. Whippings could be administered for almost any reason: working too slowly, talking back, breaking a tool, sneaking a taste of sugarcane, or purely at the overseer's whim. Some overseers were sadistically fond of their power and exercised it arbitrarily to instill terror. There are accounts of enslaved people being whipped just to set an example, or in the morning to encourage them to work faster all day. One enslaved person in Jamaica recalled that the crack of the whip was so constant that even after he became free, he couldn't hear a loud snap without trembling. This ever-present threat kept enslaved workers in a state of stress, having to always look over their shoulder. The lash is a cruel master, driving them beyond what their bodies would normally bear. However, whipping was far from the only punishment. As one historian noted, the violence went far beyond mere whipping. Planters had near total power over the bodies of the enslaved, and the laws, if any, that existed to regulate punishment were rarely enforced. Punishments could be extremely mutilating and cruel. For example, for repeated attempts at escape, it was not unusual to see an enslaved person have part of their ear cut off, or be branded on the cheek or shoulder with a hot iron letter R for runaway, marking them forever. In some cases of supposed theft or rebellion, noses or ears might be sliced off as both punishment and warning to others. The colonial records include instances of enslaved people being burned with hot tar or having limbs amputated as punishment. One of the most horrifying fates was reserved for those who dared to strike a white person or lead a rebellion. If an enslaved individual was accused of organizing resistance or attacking an overseer, the punishments often became public spectacles of terror. They could be sentenced to death in the most gruesome ways: burning alive, hanging, decapitation, or breaking on the wheel, an ancient torture where limbs are shattered. Plantation owners reasoned that by executing rebel leaders in a torturous manner, they would intimidate the rest of the enslaved population into submission. As a result, some of the most lurid examples of human cruelty on record were perpetrated in these islands. After major slave uprisings, of which there were several in Caribbean history, the reprisals were brutal. For enslaved people elsewhere, the example of those punished served as a dire warning. On some estates, one might see severed heads of executed rebels mounted on poles along the roads or at the plantation gates a ghastly deterrent to others. Bodies might be left hanging in gibbets, iron cages, to starve, or for birds to peck, an extended public execution meant to instill fear. An infamous real-world example comes not from a rebellion, but from daily cruelty recorded in a planter's diary. Thomas Thistlewood, an overseer in Jamaica, described in the 1,750 seconds a punishment he called Darby's dose, forcing one enslaved man to defecate into the mouth of another and then gagging him, a torture so vile it defies belief. This is a disturbing example, but it underscores that many slaveholders took perverse pleasure in devising cruel punishments beyond even the officially sanctioned ones. Physical torture was not the only method of domination. Enslaved people were also subjected to psychological and sexual abuse. Enslaved women, in particular, lived under the constant threat of sexual violence. Plantation owners and overseers commonly raped enslaved women, regarding them as property to be used at will. This was not framed as a punishment in planters' eyes, but rather as a privilege of ownership. Yet, for the women, and even girls, subjected to it, it was as much a part of the violence of slavery as the whip. The trauma of sexual abuse compounded the daily horrors of field labor. Women might also be punished physically for resisting these advances. Some were whipped or branded specifically for rebuffing a master's lust, or for bearing a child that the mistress of the plantation resented. Enslaved men, too, could be victims of sexual violence or humiliation, though this was less often recorded. In all, the loss of bodily autonomy was complete. An enslaved person had no say over their own body, whether in work or in intimate violation. Another form of punishment and control involved devices of restraint and humiliation. Iron collars with spikes projecting outward might be locked around the necks of slaves who were deemed disobedient, making it impossible for them to lie down comfortably or move without pain. Some were forced to wear an iron muzzle or bit, a barbaric contraption that fit over the head and put a metal piece in the mouth, preventing speech and causing great discomfort. Such muzzles were used, for instance, on slaves accused of eating cane stalks or on those who talked too much or sassed an overseer. The sight of a person wearing a grotesque iron mask or collar served as a deterrent to others and a way to break the spirit of the individual. Then there was the punishment of the chain gang. Slaves could be chained together at the ankles while working if they had tried to run away, making their already hard labor even more painful and slow. In some extreme cases, individuals would be placed in solitary confinement, small dungeon-like holes or tiny cells, and left for days on meager rations. However, on remote plantations, such facilities were rare. More often, punishment happened in the open, as theater for deterrence. The overall effect of this regime of punishment was a pervasive climate of terror. Enslaved people lived with the knowledge that at any time they could be brutally beaten, or worse, and they had virtually no legal recourse. If a planter killed a slave in punishment, it was technically a loss of property to himself, and sometimes colonial laws might nominally prohibit outright murder, but convictions were exceedingly rare. For the enslaved, that meant the planter had power of life and death over them. One rare instance of accountability occurred in 1811 on the island of Tortola, where a planter named Arthur Hodge was actually tried and executed for murdering an enslaved person. But this case was famous precisely because it was so unusual. Far more common was impunity. Planters inflicted untold cruelty without consequence. The enslaved individuals responded to this omnipresent threat in various ways. Outwardly, many learned to be very controlled in their behavior around whites, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when spoken to, appearing to agree and be servile, all as survival strategies to avoid giving any excuse for punishment. Inwardly, they carried incredible stress and anxiety. The toll on mental health must have been enormous. People lived effectively in a war-zone state of alertness, and fear their entire lives. Some chroniclers noted that slaves new from Africa, who had not yet been broken in, often reacted with open defiance or despair initially, sometimes even suicide or violent resistance when faced with this terror. Those who survived longer learned strategies to cope, though the fear never vanished. Yet, the constant brutality did not mean there was constant compliance. Many enslaved people resisted in whatever ways they safely could, as we will explore later, and they found ways to maintain their dignity and humanity under the harshest conditions. The punishments were designed to dehumanize and instill fear, but they also inadvertently bred resentment and a burning desire for freedom. One noteworthy aspect is that planters were aware they could not rely on raw terror alone to get work done effectively. While brutality was the backbone of control, they also tried manipulative tactics, offering small rewards, creating hierarchies among slaves, giving a few slaves positions of authority like drivers or skilled artisans with slightly better living conditions. This carrot and stick approach was intended to make the enslaved population police itself to some extent. A driver, for example, would be given a better hut or extra food for whipping his fellows to meet quotas. This strategy sowed distrust and prevented unity, but at the same time drivers themselves remained enslaved and could also feel the whip from the overseer if they failed to extract enough labor. Nonetheless, the overwhelming fact of plantation life was that violence underpinned everything. If an enslaved person fell ill or collapsed, and the overseer decided it was feigned, they could be flogged. If a tool broke, they might be flogged. If they were caught learning to read, for literacy was often forbidden, a severe beating or worse could follow. Women late to the field because they were caring for an infant could be whipped for laziness. A truly horrific punishment, sometimes employed, was to make the person a runner. They'd tie the slave's hands and have them run ahead of a horseman who lashed them as they ran, effectively whipping them forward until they collapsed. In short, punishment was not reserved for extraordinary crimes. It was a daily weapon of control. The enslaved lived under a cloud of dread, where any mistake or mere bad luck could lead to agony. It was a system designed to break spirits. Many mornings, as the enslaved workers trudged to the fields, they passed by a whipping post stained with blood, or saw someone limping painfully from a recent lashing, and they were reminded of exactly what awaited if they faltered. This fear was one of the main reasons that, despite outnumbering the whites heavily on many islands, enslaved people couldn't easily overthrow the system. The individual terror and divide and conquer tactics were extremely effective at keeping people under control, except in the rare moments when collective rebellion overcame it. To maintain a calm tone in describing this is itself a challenge, because the reality was anything but calm or gentle. However, it is important to convey that these horrific punishments were part of the everyday normal of plantation existence. They were administered routinely, often coldly and systematically, not always in the heat of anger. In fact, overseers sometimes kept a ledger of punishments, treating lashes like debits against offenses. This dispassionate approach could be chilling. To hurt someone so grievously without even raising one's voice. From the perspective of the enslaved, this was perhaps even more terrifying. Cruelty delivered not in rage, but as ordinary business. At the end of another brutal day, after hours of labor, some enslaved workers might yet face an appointment at the whipping post because they didn't meet a quota or some other perceived failing. Imagine the mental anguish of a man who has already worked 16 hours in the fields, being dragged to the overseer's yard to receive 25 lashes as the sun sets, while others are made to watch. His wounds might then be sprinkled with salt or lime juice, a common practice to increase pain and prevent infection just enough so he could work the next day. He might then be sent back to his hut, where he would lie on his stomach, bleeding, trying to get a little rest before dawn comes and the cycle begins anew. Tomorrow, he must work with those fresh cuts on his back, each movement a new jolt of pain. It is a scene almost too cruel to contemplate, yet it was reality for countless individuals. This reign of punishment was fundamental to why no outsider could last a day on such a plantation, not only because of the labor and heat, but because the sheer stress and trauma of living under such terror would overwhelm anyone not inured to it. Enslaved people themselves often bore the psychological scars as deeply as the physical ones. Chapter 6. Life in the Slave Quarters. When the day's labors finally ended, often not until nightfall, the enslaved workers trudged back from the fields or factories to their living area, commonly known as the slave quarters or the slave village. Here, away from the immediate gaze of the overseers, they tried to snatch a few moments of rest, family life, and personal sustenance. The conditions in the quarters were crude and basic, but this was the only home they had. Understanding what life was like in these precious after-work hours is key to grasping how enslaved people survived physically and emotionally from day to day. On many plantations, the slave quarters consisted of a cluster of small huts, cabins, or cottages set apart from the master's house, sometimes a few hundred yards away, sometimes at a greater distance on the estate. These dwellings were usually constructed of cheap, locally available materials. In the British Islands, they might be wattle and daub huts, woven stick frames plastered with mud-thatched roofs made of cane trash or palm fronds. In French or Spanish colonies, similar humble materials were used. Some cabins had wooden plank walls or were built of rough stone if available, but nothing like the solid homes of the planters. Often the floors were just hard-packed earth. The huts were small, frequently one room only, with perhaps a partition of matting to separate sleeping areas for modesty if a family lived there. A typical dimension might be around 10 or 12 feet square. They were crowded too. A whole family or several unrelated individuals might share that single space. Ventilation and comfort were minimal. In the tropical climate, the huts could be stiflingly hot at times, yet during heavy rains, they might leak badly, as the thatch or poorly tiled roofs were not well maintained by owners. Furniture was scarce, perhaps a rough wooden bench or stool, maybe a low table, and simple bedding like mats or old blankets on the floor or on crude bedsteads made of boards. Many people slept on straw or directly on the ground. There might be a fire hearth outside for cooking, as many huts did not have an indoor hearth, to reduce risk of fire spreading. Enslaved people often built these huts themselves on the orders of the master and had to periodically repair them also on their own time. Despite these Spartan conditions, the quarters were a world of relative autonomy after dark. Here, enslaved Africans tried to carve out a semblance of domestic life and community under oppression. After slogging back home with limbs weary and backs throbbing, individuals would attend to their immediate needs. If any food was to be prepared for the evening meal, now was the time. Perhaps a small fire flickered between 3 stones at the front of a hut, with a battered iron pot on it, as a woman stirred a meagre stew of vegetables, maybe okra, yams, or plantains, flavored with a bit of salted fish, if available. The provision of food by the owners was usually inadequate, so enslaved families had to be resourceful to avoid hunger. Rations were typically given out weekly by the plantation storekeeper. For instance, one common allotment in British colonies was a few pounds of starch, like cornmeal, cassava, or yams, and a bit of salted meat or fish. On some islands, a standard ration per adult might be something like 2-3 pounds of salted fish, often cheap herring, and 6-8 pounds of yam or sweet potato per week, plus maybe some cornmeal. This was barely sufficient calories for a heavy worker, and often lacking in vitamins and variety. Owners were reluctant to sacrifice any profit by giving more or better food. In fact, many planters preferred to import low-cost foodstuffs, like saltfish, from North America, rather than devote fertile land to growing food for the enslaved. Enslaved people often faced malnutrition, especially at certain times of year, or if shipments of rations were delayed. They learned to supplement rations by raising small gardens and livestock. On Sundays, the one day typically free from field labor by custom, enslaved families would work on their own provision grounds, plots of land allocated by the plantation for them to cultivate food. These provision grounds were usually on marginal land the planters didn't care to use, rocky hillsides or distant patches. There they planted crops like cassava, yams, sweet potatoes, plantains, corn, and beans, hardy staples that could keep them fed. Some even managed to keep chickens, pigs, or goats, which they could slaughter occasionally or use for eggs and milk. The output from these gardens was crucial. It meant the difference between just surviving and starvation, especially if rations were cut, or if extra mouths like small children or the elderly, who got smaller rations, needed feeding. By the early 18th century, enslaved people's produce became a significant part of the local food supply. On Nevis, for example, enslaved Africans dominated the Sunday market with the vegetables and other goods they grew or raised. After a long workday, however, tending these gardens or cooking a meal required additional effort from bodies that had little left to give. Nevertheless, many would drag themselves to their provision ground in the twilight to fetch some fresh cassava or greens, or spend an hour weeding their personal garden even when their backs ached. It was a harsh irony. The enslaved had to labor on their free time as well, just to ensure they wouldn't starve. A traveler in the Caribbean might have observed candle lights or small fires dotting the slave village well into the night, as people cooked or repaired their huts or sewed a rag of clothing. Clothing itself was a scarce commodity. Planters typically issued only a minimal allotment of clothes, often just 2 sets of garments per year, one for the working months and one slightly better for Sundays or holidays. An adult man might receive a couple of cheap linen shirts and maybe a pair of Osnaburg, coarse linen trousers, plus perhaps a woolen jacket or blanket for the cooler nights in certain seasons. Women received rough cotton or linen dresses or skirts and blouses, often in plain Negro cloth. These clothes deteriorated quickly under the strain of field work and washing. Children frequently went naked until adolescence or wore simple shifts. At night in the quarters, people often wore the same clothes they worked in, or little at all, letting their sweat-drenched garments dry on a line if possible. In those dark huts, many likely slept nude or in undergarments to be more comfortable in the heat, with perhaps a thin sheet if the night was cool. One of the few consolations of the day was being able to spend a little time with family or companions in the quarters. Enslaved people tried to form family units and social bonds whenever possible, despite the constant threat of separation by sale or assignment. If both a husband and wife were on the same plantation, not always the case. The evening was when they could be together and share news about their day. They might tend to their children, cleaning them, feeding them a little supper, maybe playing softly with an infant or telling a child to behave. Parenting under slavery was heartbreaking. Mothers and fathers knew their children could be taken from them at any time, and many had already experienced such loss. Still, they loved and cared for them fiercely in the hours they had. In the quarters, a mother might sing a quiet lullaby to her child in an African language, rocking them to sleep after a day in which even toddlers might have been out in the sun, helping scare birds or carry water. Community ties extended beyond blood relations. People formed surrogate families, adopting roles like auntie or uncle for children who had lost parents or whose parents lived on other plantations. It was common for enslaved people to have spouses or partners on neighboring plantations due to the demographics manipulated by owners. For example, owners often encouraged enslaved men to take wives from a different estate so that the man wouldn't run away, being tied by family, a cruel strategy to discourage escape. In such cases, those abroad marriages meant the couple only saw each other on Sunday or occasional nights with a special pass. In the quarters on a Saturday night, one might witness a rare and tender reunion. An enslaved husband from a nearby plantation, quietly permitted to visit his wife for the night. They would embrace under the stars, grateful for a few hours together before he had to return by dawn. Food, family, and rest were the main focus of the evening, but cultural and spiritual life also persisted in the quarters. Despite every effort of slavery to strip them of identity, enslaved Africans preserved parts of their heritage and forged new Creole cultures. After supper, if energy allowed, there might be gentle conversations between neighbors. In some quarters, older people told stories to the young ones, tales of Anansi, the trickster spider from West African folklore, or cautionary tales with moral lessons. These storytelling sessions were more than entertainment. They were a way to pass down knowledge, values, and a sense of identity. The dialect or language used could be a Creole mixture of African tongues and European languages, something unique to each island. Through language and story, the enslaved nurtured a spark of their own humanity against the dehumanization of slavery. Music was another vital part of life, though loud music and drumming were often restricted by planters who feared that drums could be used to send signals for rebellion. Still, humming, singing quietly, or using body rhythms, clapping, foot tapping, persisted. In some places, on weekend nights or holidays, there might be communal dances. Travelers in the Caribbean noted seeing slaves gather to dance traditional dances on a Saturday night, if allowed. Women in circles singing call and response songs, men playing percussion on improvised instruments, maybe a drum made from a barrel, or just beating a rhythm on a hoe or pot. Such moments of joyous expression were rare and had to be careful, but they were soul-nourishing. Through song and dance, enslaved people found a release for their emotions, sorrow, hope, defiance, and reaffirmed their bonds with each other. The songs often had double meanings. A seemingly simple work tune might hide a prayer for deliverance or an expression of anger towards the master, all couched in metaphors only they understood. Religion and spirituality provided another coping mechanism. In the Caribbean, enslaved Africans brought with them various spiritual traditions: Igbo, Akan, Congo, Yoruba, and others, and these mixed both with each other and, eventually, with Christianity that missionaries or planters introduced. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many planters allowed or even encouraged Christian preaching among slaves, hoping it would make them more docile, teach them to obey their masters. Enslaved people often gravitated toward Baptist or Methodist missionaries in British Islands who preached a message that everyone's equal in God's eyes. Some sincerely converted, blending Christian beliefs with African ones. Others maintained older beliefs in secret, such as voodoo, vodou in Haiti, Shango in Trinidad, or Obeah in Jamaica, forms of folk spirituality that involved rituals, herbal knowledge, and communication with ancestors or spirits. At night in the quarters, one might see small altars or hear whispered prayers. A mother might tie a protective amulet around her child's neck, an Obeah charm to ward off illness or the evil eye. They drew comfort from the idea that, despite all their suffering, a higher power, or the spirits of their ancestors, watched over them. The weekly rhythm of life in the quarters often culminated on Sunday. Planters generally did not force field labor on Sundays, partly because of religious norms and partly to avoid rebellions by denying all rest. On Sunday mornings, enslaved people often attended to personal chores, washing and mending their clothes, cleaning their huts, tending their gardens. Many plantation villages bustled with activity at dawn on Sundays. By mid-morning, there might be a market in the nearest town or at a crossroads, where enslaved vendors gathered to sell or trade produce from their provision grounds. In Charlestown, Nevis, for example, the Sunday market ran from sunrise to about 9 a.m., where enslaved people brought fowls, Indian corn, yams, and garden stuff of all sorts to trade. This was an important economic outlet. Slaves could earn a little money or goods which they might use to buy extra food, fabric for clothing, or small luxuries like tobacco, sugar. Ironically, they sometimes had to buy the sugar they themselves produced to sweeten their own coffee or rum. On such days, one could witness a bit of liveliness. Women balancing baskets on their heads, bargaining in loud voices at the marketplace. A brief sense of being regular people in a community rather than enslaved laborers. Sundays also provided time for social and religious gatherings. Visiting between plantations was common if allowed. A man might walk several miles to see a wife or child on another estate. Some would gather for worship. By the 19th century, it was not unusual to see hundreds of enslaved people attending outdoor prayer meetings, led by black or white preachers, singing Christian hymns with great emotion. Although planters were wary of large gatherings, religious meetings were sometimes tolerated as a safety valve and a way to impart morals about obedience. Enslaved worshippers, for their part, often infused these meetings with their own style, energetic singing, clapping, maybe subtle messages of hope for freedom drawn from biblical stories like the Israelites escaping Pharaoh's bondage. However, it is important not to romanticize the free time enslaved people had. Leisure was scant and hard-earned. After a back-breaking week, Sunday might not even feel like a day off, because it was filled with all the tasks they couldn't do on workdays. Growing food, fixing huts, washing clothes, caring for children, etc. Real relaxation, like simply resting under a tree or spending an afternoon on recreation, was minimal. Perhaps occasionally, on a Sunday afternoon, if their chores were done, a group of young men might play a rudimentary game, maybe wrestling or racing, or a form of football with a makeshift ball of rags. Maybe a group of women friends would sit together, plaiting each other's hair into braids, chatting softly about memories of home or hopes for the future. These small moments of human connection were precious. Nightfall on Sundays brought a return to the port. Inevitable reality that tomorrow was Monday, and the endless cycle of toil would begin anew at dawn. In the slave quarters that night, parents comforted crying children who disliked the taste of the quinine or herbal tonic forced on them to ward off fever. An old grandmother, her back too damaged for fieldwork anymore, told a story of Africa to whoever would listen, speaking of rivers and villages far across the ocean, as if they were fairy tales. Some younger folks whispered about rumors they had heard, that maybe in England, the abolitionists were campaigning to end the slave trade. True, as it was abolished in 1807 for the British Empire, or that freedom might come someday. Others perhaps passed along news from other plantations. Which overseer was especially cruel, which slave had dared to run away last week, and whether he was caught. The quarters were a place where information circulated in a grapevine beyond the master's control. In those exchanges, the seeds of larger cumbiod resistance were quietly sown. We will explore that soon. By late night, the fires in front of the huts burned down to embers. In the darkness, one could hear the sounds of the slave village, a baby fussing and being hushed, insects chirping in the bush, perhaps a distant dog barking. Now and then, a muffled sob, someone quietly crying from pain or grief or sheer exhaustion, careful not to be heard by others. More often, just the breathing of dozens of people in their huts, finally at rest for a few hours, their bodies sprawled in whatever posture, brought a little relief from the constant aches. Couples held each other if they were lucky enough to be together. Children snuggled against their mothers. In sleep, for a short while, they could escape into dreams, dreams that might be of home, or of a different life, or perhaps simple ones like a full belly and a day without beating. The slave quarters, with all their hardship, were also a sanctuary of a sort. They were the only entretenture, space where the enslaved had some degree of control over their immediate surroundings. Here they built their own community, culture, and support systems as much as they could. It was in the quarters that African traditions were preserved, that new Afro-Caribbean cultures were born, that love and kinship bloomed in the cracks of a cruel world. The quarters saw laughter as well as tears, the jokes shared among friends, the courtship of young couples under the moonlight, the celebration of a new baby's birth, mingled with anxiety for that child's future, or the mourning songs for those who died. In essence, the life in the quarters was about survival and humanity. Enslaved people worked all day like cogs in a machine, but in the evenings, they asserted that they were human beings, cooking their food, raising their families, praying to their gods, singing their songs. This kept them alive in body and spirit. Without these moments to recharge and recall who they were, the relentless labor and punishment might have utterly crushed them. Many later testified that it was the love of family, the fellowship with others, and their faith or traditions that gave them the strength to endure one day after another. However, even in these free hours, the spectre of slavery loomed. Everyone knew that the next morning the horn would blow, and they would once again be under the yoke. And they also knew that the master's power intruded even into their private sphere. A slave owner could come to the quarters at any time, even at night, to drag someone out for punishment, or to satisfy some vile whim, such as the common occurrence of a master taking an enslaved woman from her bed for sexual exploitation. The quarters were not truly safe, but they were all the enslaved had. As the night deepened, exhaustion typically overcame fear for a while. People slept, and if one peered into a hut, one might see entire families collapsed in sleep, intertwined in a way that maximizes the use of the small space. Perhaps a father's arm thrown protectively over a child, or siblings curled up back to back. In sleep, faces that were tense or blank in the daytime might relax into something like peace. It is poignant to think that in sleep, the enslaved were free. Their minds could roam away from the cane fields to anywhere, but dawn would always come, and with it the cruel sun and the overseer's horn. Chapter 7: Sickness, Death, and Short Lives. Given the relentless labor and harsh living conditions we have described, it is no surprise that health on the plantations was extremely poor. Enslaved people in the Caribbean sugar colonies suffered from a host of ailments and diseases, and they received little in the way of proper medical care. The human body can only take so much abuse before it breaks down. On these plantations, bodies were pushed far beyond normal limits, and the consequences were dire. Illness, disability, and early death were pervasive. In fact, the life expectancy of an enslaved field worker on a sugar plantation was appallingly short. The planters were well aware of this. They calculated it coldly into their business plans, often choosing to use up a slave in a few years and then buy another, rather than preserving a life for the long term. From the moment enslaved Africans arrived in the Caribbean, they were exposed to new diseases and stresses. Many newly arrived captives underwent a seasoning period, a euphemism for the first 1 or 2 years, when death rates were extremely high, as they adjusted to the new disease environment and brutal work regime. Having survived the Middle Passage, they now faced Caribbean fevers and illnesses for which they had little immunity. Local observers noted that the average lifespan of a slave who survived the initial acclimation in Jamaica was expected to be less than 20 years thereafter. Disease decimated incoming slave populations, as one source bluntly states. Planters sometimes kept new Africans somewhat separate for a short time, in isolation, hothouses, or pens, in hopes they would get through the worst of the tropical diseases without infecting the seasoned population. But such measures did little to ultimately reduce mortality. The plantation environment itself was a breeding ground for disease. The quarters were crowded and often unsanitary. With no proper sewage, people fell ill from dysentery and other bowel diseases caused by contaminated water and food. Dysentery, known as the flux, was a frequent killer, causing severe dehydration, especially in children. Respiratory illnesses like pneumonia or tuberculosis could spread in the damp, cramped huts, especially when people's resistance was low from malnutrition. Skin diseases and infections were rife. Enslaved laborers often had untreated cuts and wounds from work that could turn septic. They also suffered from tropical ulcers and skin infections like yaws, a bacterial illness common in the Caribbean that causes sores and bone pain. Yaws spread easily in conditions of poor hygiene and was often mistaken for leprosy by Europeans. It could be debilitating if untreated. Malnutrition itself was a chronic problem, weakening the immune system. Although provision grounds and rations provided carbohydrates, diets were often lacking in vital nutrients like proteins and vitamins. This led to deficiency diseases. For instance, pellagra, caused by niacin, vitamin B3 deficiency, might have been present. It leads to skin lesions, diarrhea, and dementia if severe. Some historians believe enslaved people's skin ailments, classified as leprosy or other names, could have been due to vitamin deficiencies like pellagra. Scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, was another risk if fresh produce was scarce. It causes swollen gums, weakness, and bleeding under the skin. Plantation records occasionally mention mysterious illnesses that likely had nutritional causes. The tropical climate offered its own array of diseases. Malaria was endemic on many islands, spread by mosquitoes breeding in the warm climate. Africans from certain regions had some genetic resistance to malaria, the sickle cell trait, and often greater prior exposure, but it still took a toll. Yellow fever was another mosquito-borne disease that periodically swept through, though interestingly, it tended to kill more Europeans, who lacked any exposure, and newly arrived Africans than those Creoles, locally born slaves, who had survived childhood exposure. Nonetheless, fever epidemics could kill enslaved people by the dozens in a short time. Smallpox occasionally broke out as well, though over time some communities developed immunity or were variolated. An early form of inoculation was sometimes administered by enlightened physicians to slaves, partly to protect their investment. One of the biggest factors in early death was simply overwork and exposure. Continuous, hard labor under sun and rain broke down the body's resilience. Heat stroke was a real danger. A person might collapse in the field with a high fever and delirium from working under direct sun with insufficient water. The overseer might see it as feigned illness and punish them, but often it was genuine and could be fatal if the person's core temperature soared. Constant stooping and lifting led to musculoskeletal problems, chronic back pain, hernias, joint inflammation. These were young people, essentially made old before their time. Injuries contributed to mortality too. We described how a moment's slip in the cane mill could cost a limb. Not everyone survived such trauma. Infections from amputations or crushed bones could kill, especially given the rudimentary medical care. Maybe a dirty saw to cut off a mangled arm, and then pouring rum on the wound as antiseptic. Burns from the boiling house accidents likewise could lead to agonizing deaths from infection. Even smaller injuries, like a deep gash from a machete while cutting cane, could turn gangrenous. Medical help for an enslaved person was minimal. Some plantations had a doctor on retainer, but his time was limited and often his cures were ineffective or brutal bleeding, purging, etc. Enslaved healers using herbs often did more good. They had knowledge of bush medicine to treat fevers or dress wounds with medicinal leaves. But they could only do so much against the structural. Violence wearing everyone down. All these factors meant that death was a common presence on plantations. Enslaved parents saw many of their children die young, and children saw their parents die before reaching middle age. To quantify this, historians estimate that on many sugar estates, the death rate exceeded the birth rate by a significant margin. In Jamaica, in the early 19th century, for example, annual mortality among slaves on sugar plantations was around 3.5%, 35 per 1,000. This may sound small, but year after year, it compounded to catastrophic losses, especially since births could not keep up. Enslaved women did have children. Some planters encouraged it, others did not care. But infant mortality was horrifically high. Often over 50% of babies died in their first year. Some sources suggest that half of all slave children never reached their 5th birthday. Causes included malnutrition of mothers, hard labor deep into pregnancy, inadequate milk. Nursing mothers were often given insufficient rest and food, unsanitary conditions leading to infant diseases, and zero access to proper pediatric care. Mothers were typically forced back to fieldwork just weeks after giving birth, leaving infants in the care of the too young or the too old in the quarters. One can imagine the heartbreak of a mother hearing her baby wail with hunger from the edge of the fields, but being powerless to go to them until hours later. Many infants simply did not survive in such an environment. For those who survived childhood, the prime of life was often cut short. It was commonly remarked, sometimes almost casually by planters, that a slave wore out after about 7 to 10 years of field labor. Indeed, data from various islands suggested that a newly imported African might only live another 7 to 9 years on average under the brutal regimen. Even those born into slavery and adapted to local conditions had life expectations drastically shorter than free people. A slave in his or her 30 seconds was middle-aged. Reaching 50 or 60 was rare and usually possible only for those in less grueling domestic roles or who had been deliberately somewhat spared. The first gang field hands, the strongest youths, paid for their strength by being worked nearly to death. Recall the structure. By 40, a field slave was considered worn out and shuffled to lighter duties, if they even made it that long. Many did not. It's telling that on some large estates, the majority of enslaved people were often teenagers or young adults. The older generation was comparatively thin in number, having been decimated by toil. We have concrete evidence of this horrendous attrition. One planter in Barbados, Edward Littleton, calculated that if he owned 100 slaves, all working in sugar cultivation, he would kill them all in 19 years. In other words, roughly 5% of his workforce would die off every year under normal operations. Effectively a complete turnover in under 2 decades. Littleton's grim arithmetic proved broadly accurate in many cases. Plantation records and censuses bear it out. For example, between 1,748 and 1,788, over 335,000 enslaved Africans were imported into the British colony of Jamaica to replenish the labor force. Yet in 1788, Jamaica's total slave population was only about 226,000. Even with all who had been there before 1748, the more than 335,000 new arrivals, and all of the children born to enslaved mothers, this gap implies a vast number died in those 4 decades. Literally, hundreds of thousands perished just to keep a steady workforce of a couple 100,000 alive at any one time. The island was a slaughterhouse in slow motion. What happened when an enslaved person fell gravely ill? Planters were not entirely indifferent. After all, a sick slave could not work and was a potential loss of investment. Some estates had a rudimentary sick house or shed where ill slaves were sent to recuperate. However, conditions there were often poor as well. European doctors of the time had limited knowledge. Treatments might include bleeding with leeches, giving emetics to induce vomiting, or laxatives to purge, which often weakened the patient further. Enslaved people preferred their own healers, who used herbal remedies. For fever, they might brew a tea of cerasee bush or fever grass. For dysentery, they might chew guava leaves or administer charcoal. They nursed each other when allowed, a mother caring for a sick child, or friends tending someone's wounds after a whipping. The compassion and care within the enslaved community was likely the most effective healthcare they had. Nonetheless, if a person could not work for too long, some masters lost patience. There are accounts of slaves being whipped to force them out of bed, even when ill, or threatened with sale down the river to an even harsher plantation if they didn't recover quickly. Chronic illness or disability could lead to truly callous outcomes. The person might be sold off cheap to smaller farms, or simply receive less food and care, accelerating their demise. Only occasionally did a planter free an elderly or disabled slave, and usually that was in wills, as a benevolent gesture by owners on their deathbed. For enslaved women, health challenges included the hazards of pregnancy and childbirth under cruel conditions. Expectant mothers were sometimes given lighter work in the later months, but this depended on the owner's disposition. Miscarriages were frequent. 1. Because women were malnourished and overworked. And 2. Sadly, some women may have induced miscarriages through herbal means to avoid bringing a child into slavery. If they carried to term, birth often took place in the quarters helped by midwives from among the slave women. There might be 1 or 2 experienced midwife healers on a large plantation who handled all deliveries. Despite their skill, maternal mortality was a risk. A difficult birth could turn deadly, with no access to surgery. No C-sections in that era that mothers survived. If the mother survived, she had scant time to heal. As mentioned, she'd be back in the fields within weeks. Her newborn left with others, or even sometimes brought to the edge of the fields in a basket, so she could nurse occasionally between tasks. Under such conditions, it's miraculous any babies survived at all. The psychological strain also impacted health. Today, we understand how chronic stress can weaken the immune system and exacerbate illness. The enslaved endured daily terror and anxiety, fearing punishment, worrying about loved ones, enduring humiliation. This undoubtedly manifested in ailments, headaches, ulcers, depression, though not labeled as such at the time. Plantations did see instances of what was called melancholia, or even insanity among slaves, usually dismissed by owners as congenital or due to their savagery. But we can recognize that unrelenting trauma can break the mind as well as the body. So, how long could someone last under all this? Not long. The typical lifespan of an enslaved person in the Caribbean was drastically cut short. If someone reached their late 30 seconds or 40 seconds, they might be visibly aged, with grey hair, missing teeth, arthritic limbs, and a body worn out by continuous labor and beatings. They might have old fracture scars, cane cutter's arthritis, chronic respiratory issues from years of inhaling mill dust and furnace smoke, and perhaps tropical ulcers on their legs that never fully healed. Many died before even reaching that stage. Death could come from an acute event, a fever, a beating that caused internal injuries, an infection, or from cumulative exhaustion that one day led them not to wake up. Plantation burial records, where they exist, show a constant stream of funerals. These funerals, usually conducted by the slave community, sometimes clandestinely at night with African rites, other times with a Christian prayer, if a missionary was present, were heartbreakingly frequent. Enslaved people mourned their dead with as much dignity and tradition as they could. In some places, they had graveyards, often unmarked, in a corner of the estate. In other cases, they buried loved ones near old trees or special spots that might have spiritual significance. Each grave was a stark reminder of the human cost of sugar, each one a mother, father, child, friend who had fallen victim to the plantation's demands. From the perspective of the plantation owners, these lives were essentially disposable units of labor. This sounds cruel, and it was. They considered it more profitable to work people to death and buy replacements than to allow longer, healthier lives with reduced workloads. As noted, many owners simply imported new slaves to replace casualties rather than improve conditions, until abolitionists and changing economic conditions forced a shift. That was the twelve business model of the Sugar Islands. This contrasts with slavery in some other regions, like the United States in the 19th century, where, because the Atlantic slave trade was banned and it became harder to acquire new slaves, owners had more incentive to try to keep their slaves alive and even encourage population growth. In the Caribbean, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, that incentive was weak. The transatlantic trade kept supplying fresh labor at a terrible human cost. By the early 19th century, the situation had become slightly less grim on some estates, partly due to the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807 and movements to ameliorate slave conditions. Planters were pressured to ensure at least self-reproduction of the enslaved population. There were attempts, not always sincere, to improve diet, allow a bit more rest for pregnant women, etc. In practice, conditions remained awful until emancipation, but perhaps the mortality slowed marginally in the final years. Nonetheless, when slavery finally ended in the British colonies in the 1832 and in the French in 1848 and earlier in Haiti via revolution, the records showed a hugely depleted people. The survivors bore deep physical and mental scars. To sum up, the toll of sickness and death on Caribbean plantations was immense. Enslaved people truly lived on a precipice, where one injury or fever could push them over the edge. Their bodies, already strained by endless labor, had few defenses against disease. The average enslaved laborer wouldn't last a day, not just for one day's work, but truly not many years in that environment. And indeed, most did not last many years. Those who managed to live longer did so either by some luck, slightly less brutal treatment, or exceptional resilience. Every sunrise was an act of defiance in a way. They had survived another perilous night, only to face the gauntlet of the day. This grim environment of early death underlines the bitter truth behind our theme. If a modern person were placed in that scenario, they likely would not survive even the short span that many enslaved people endured. It took a kind of hardened endurance, forged often from childhood, to handle the constant assaults on one's health. And even that could only extend life so far when the external conditions were so lethal. Chapter 8. Broken Bodies, Unbroken Spirit. By now it is clear that the slavery system in the Caribbean was designed to break human beings, physically, mentally, and spiritually. And yet, remarkably, not all was broken. In countless instances, enslaved people demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and an unyielding spirit that slavery could not fully extinguish. If the body was tortured, the mind might still find ways to cope or resist. If an individual could not openly fight the system, they might still preserve a sense of self and hope in subtle ways. This chapter examines how people endured the unendurable, the compromises they made, and the inner resources they called upon to survive years in conditions that should have been unsurvivable even for a day. One key to endurance was mental adaptation. Enslaved people developed a sort of psychological armor, behaviors and attitudes that helped them get through the daily traumas. We have touched on some. The outward compliance many showed to avoid punishment, for example. Even while they may have felt rage or sorrow inside, they learned when to speak and when to stay silent. A Jamaican proverb from slavery times went, "Play fool to catch wise," meaning sometimes one pretends ignorance or docility to navigate a dangerous situation. This could mean feigning a smile or a song in front of the master while cursing him under one's breath in private. It could mean saying, "Yes, massa," while secretly planning an escape. Such duality was a constant. Enslaved people became adept at masking their true feelings, a necessary skill under tyranny. They also drew on cultural strengths. Spiritual belief, as we saw, was a huge source of solace. Many truly believed that a just God, or their ancestral spirits, would eventually deliver them from bondage. If not in this life, then in the next. This faith gave them the courage to face another day. A hymn sung quietly at night, with lyrics about the Israelites escaping Pharaoh, could renew someone's determination to persevere until freedom came. Likewise, community support was vital. They were all in the same boat, and that fostered a sense of solidarity. Women would help nurse each other's children. Men would covertly share tips on how to slacken pace without getting caught. The experienced would teach the young how to endure a whipping by numbing the mind. They mourned together when one of their community died, and that collective grieving perhaps made the burden of loss slightly more bearable. On plantations where Africans from the same ethnic group were numerous, they formed nations or secret societies, keeping old traditions alive. These groups provided social structure and emotional refuge. Even on plantations where people came from diverse backgrounds, new Creole cultures and friendships emerged, binding people together with common language and customs born in slavery. Personal agency, even in small measures, was another important concept. Slaves had very little control over their lives, but they found areas where they could exert some choice. For example, while an overseer dictated their work, they might decide to slow their hoe just a little when his back was turned, a tiny assertion of autonomy. This was a form of what some historians call day-to-day resistance, or passive resistance. It included things like feigning illness to get a short respite from work, working slowly or clumsily, pretending not to understand instructions so as to reduce output without incurring outright punishment, often called foot dragging, sabotaging equipment. Subtly, a tool might mysteriously break better a broken hoe than a broken back, or a mule might go missing for a few hours, delaying work. Pilfering provisions, taking a bit of sugar, a few ears of corn, or a chicken from the master's stores to supplement their own needs. This was dangerous if caught, but many took the risk to feed their families, or simply to get back at the master in some small way, maintaining and teaching their own knowledge. For instance, secretly learning to read and write despite laws against slave literacy in some colonies, or passing down herbal medical knowledge, which gave them a degree of independence from white doctors. These quiet acts of resistance were a way to assert, we are not mere machines or animals, we have will and intelligence. They also helped psychologically by giving the oppressed a sense of agency, however limited. For the enslaved, even small victories, like successfully hiding a little sugar for one's child to have a sweet taste, or causing a half-day delay in production by misdirecting an ox cart, could be deeply satisfying. It was evidence that the slaveholders did not have absolute power over their minds and actions. Of course, these subtle forms of resistance sometimes met harsh retaliation if discovered. An overseer who realized slaves were playing dumb or breaking tools on Daingarnig's purpose might respond with whippings or other collective punishments. Thus, such acts required cunning and care. It became a kind of psychological warfare, slaves constantly probing how much they could get away with, masters constantly suspicious that they were being outwitted. Interestingly, some planters' diaries complain that their slaves were lazy or deceitful, not recognizing those behaviors as rational responses to oppressive conditions. Indeed, it's almost darkly comedic that planters expected cheerful industriousness, as if enslaved humans should genuinely want to maximize their output for someone else's profit. The reality was that enslaved workers engaged in a continual, quiet battle of wits to preserve some control over their labor and bodies. Not everyone coped or adapted, however. There were breaking points. Some people tragically concluded that death was preferable to continued slavery. Throughout the slave era, there are accounts of suicide among the enslaved, especially in the early period, newly arrived. Africans sometimes refused to eat, believing their souls would return to Africa if they died, or even jumped overboard from slave ships or off docks in hopes of reunion with ancestors in the afterlife. On plantations, individuals who were brutally abused or who lost all family might take their own life as an escape. Planters recorded instances of slaves hanging themselves or ingesting poisonous herbs. Such events were often covered up or attributed to madness, since admitting that conditions drove people to suicide would reflect poorly on slaveholders. But the truth was clear to the enslaved community. These were comrades who, in despair, sought freedom in death when life became too much to bear. The toll of slavery on the mind was immense, and not everyone could endure it indefinitely. Others reached a different breaking point, not one of surrender, but of defiance. These individuals chose to risk everything in active resistance, which we will explore in the next chapter. Before moving on to that, however, it's worth discussing the complex social dynamics that slavery created among the enslaved themselves. Not all enslaved people were united or equal in experience. We've mentioned the role of drivers, enslaved overseers, who were given authority to discipline others. This was one of the system's most insidious aspects. It forced some slaves into the position of oppressors over their own kin. A driver might be hated by field slaves for wielding the whip on the master's behalf, yet he too was in a bind. If he refused to enforce, the master would punish him or replace him. Some drivers tried to moderate punishments or secretly warned their fellows of upcoming inspections. Others perhaps relished the relative power and better rations that came with the role. Similarly, there were skilled artisans or house servants who lived a notch above field laborers, with better food, maybe even a decent piece of clothing, or occasional coins from tips. These slight differences could breed jealousy or resentment among the enslaved ranks. Planters exploited this by fostering rivalries, for example, giving one slave a minor reward for informing on others, or playing different ethnic groups against each other. Yet, many enslaved people saw through these tactics and remained solidaristic. They maintained that, privileged or not, we are all in bondage together. There are accounts of domestic slaves secretly aiding field slaves, like a cook slipping some extra meat to a hungry field hand, or a coachman delivering messages between separated family members on different plantations. Enslaved midwives would assist any woman in labor, whether she was a fellow field hand or the planter's own mistress's maid. These acts illustrate a profound human compassion that persisted despite the slaveholders' efforts to divide. In short, while slavery in the Caribbean inflicted unimaginable suffering, it did not wholly crush the human spirit. There were cracks in the edifice where the light of humanity shone through, in a lullaby sung to a child, in a joke shared at the master's expense behind a barn, in a forbidden drumbeat after midnight, in an old man's advice to keep your heart alive, even when your back is bent. Enslaved people were victims of a brutal system, but they were not just passive victims. They were also agents, survivors, strategists, and sometimes rebels. As a modern observer, one might still wonder, how could they endure even a week of this, let alone years or decades? The answer lies partly in these mechanisms of endurance we've outlined: faith, community, subtle resistance, and sheer willpower. It lies also in something deeper, a hope that someday change would come. For as long as slavery existed, enslaved people never stopped yearning and struggling for freedom. That hope and struggle is the final piece of the story we must discuss. In the next chapter, we will look at the more overt forms of resistance, the daring escapes, the maroon communities in the hills, and the uprisings that shook the colonial world. Those acts of rebellion were the culmination of the daily defiance and resilience that we have already seen. They proved that even under the harshest regime, the desire for liberty was never extinguished. All enslaved people, from newly trafficked Africans to seasoned field workers, from children forced to work as soon as they could use a small hoe, to experienced drivers negotiating within the system, responded to their condition in complex ways that kept the flame of freedom alive. We will see how those flames finally combined into the blaze that ended slavery itself. Chapter 9: Rebellion and Emancipation. Throughout the centuries of Caribbean slavery, enslaved people never ceased yearning and striving for freedom. The daily forms of resistance we described sometimes flared into open rebellion, and even when uprisings were suppressed, the dream of liberation lived on. Eventually, that dream was realized, first in one dramatic instance in Haiti, and later through abolitionist movements and legislation in the European empires. In this chapter, we trace how the fierce desire for freedom led to acts of rebellion, and how those acts, combined with shifting political tides, brought the cruel era of plantation slavery to an end. Running away. Marronage. One of the most direct ways an enslaved person could resist was to flee the plantation. Given the harsh punishments for escape, branding, mutilation, or death if caught, it was an incredibly courageous act. Yet many tried. Some escapes were temporary. A desperate individual might slip into the woods for a few days of respite, practice called petit marronage, perhaps to recover from a whipping or to visit family on a neighboring estate, before hunger or fear of capture drove them back. Others attempted permanent escape, grand marronage, fleeing into the wilderness, aiming never to return. The Caribbean islands had diverse terrains, dense mountain forests, swamps, or hinterlands where fugitives could hide. Over time, communities of escaped slaves formed in remote areas. These were known as maroon communities. In Jamaica, for example, Maroons established themselves in the rugged Blue Mountains. These communities, composed of runaways from various plantations, defended their freedom fiercely. They raided plantations for supplies, freed other slaves, and repelled colonial militias sent to subdue them. The Maroons of Jamaica fought the British colonial forces in the 1,730 to a standstill, leading to a treaty in 1739 that recognized their autonomy on certain lands. Though controversial, they agreed in return to help return future runaways, a condition that pitted them against newly escaped slaves. This treaty essentially created a free enclave of black ex-slaves in the heart of a slave colony. Similar Maroon societies existed elsewhere: the Windward Maroons in eastern Jamaica, the Bush Negroes, Nuka, Saramacca, etc., of Suriname's rainforests, the Highland Palenqueros in Spanish New Granada, Colombia, and smaller bands in Dominica, St. Vincent, Guadeloupe, Cuba, and other places. These Maroon communities were living proof that slavery was not omnipotent. In the very midst of slave societies, there were people who had won their freedom by courage, cunning, and force of arms. Rebellions on plantations. Beyond flight, enslaved people sometimes organized outright insurrections. These were extremely perilous. Conspirators risked not only their own lives but brutal retaliation against their entire community if a revolt failed. Despite this, history records numerous rebellions in the found Caribbean. In 1733, on the tiny island of St. John, then Danish, enslaved Africans launched a revolt, seizing control of the island for several months. It took a combined force of Danish, French, and Swiss troops to eventually quash it. In Jamaica, a major uprising known as Tacky's War erupted in 1760. Led by a man named Tacky, enslaved Akan, people from present-day Ghana, revolted, killing overseers and planter families, and trying to establish control. They were suppressed after months of fighting and reprisals, but their bold action terrified planters and inspired future resistance. In the French colony of Grenada, actually under British at the time of revolt, Julien Fédon, a free man of colour, led a rebellion in 1795 that drew in many slaves. They held large parts of the island for around a year. Countless smaller revolts and planned conspiracies were uncovered and foiled by authorities. For example, the Barbados Revolt of 1816, known as Bussa's Rebellion, the Demerara Rebellion of 1823 inches, Guyana, and the Baptist War, Christmas Rebellion of 1831 inches, Jamaica, led by Samuel Sharp. These rebellions often had similar grievances: cruelty of overseers, desire for better treatment, or outright freedom, and they were influenced by news of global events. For instance, the French Revolution's talk of liberty and equality traveled to the colonies, sparking hope that those ideals might apply to slaves as well. Enslaved people were not isolated. They heard news through sailors, free people of color, or even eavesdropping on their masters. By the late 18th century, a truly explosive situation had developed in the richest colony of them all, Saint-Domingue, the French half of the island of Hispaniola. The Haitian Revolution, 1791, 1804. This is the most spectacular instance of enslaved people not only rebelling, but successfully destroying slavery and founding a new nation. Saint-Domingue, was a land of enormous plantations and brutal conditions, some say even worse than Jamaica or Barbados, given extremely high death rates. In 1791, inspired partly by the French Revolution's rhetoric and partly by their own intolerable suffering, the slaves of the northern plain of Saint-Domingue rose in a massive revolt. Within weeks, cane fields and sugar works were ablaze. White planter families were either killed or fled in terror. The rebellion, initially leaderless, coalesced under figures like Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and others, themselves formerly enslaved or free blacks. This uprising turned into a full-scale war. The French, Spanish, and British all intervened at various points, but the determined black armies, including many hardened by guerrilla fighting and motivated by the prospect of liberty, eventually triumphed. In 1794, the French revolutionary government, desperate to retain the colony's loyalty against Britain and Spain, actually abolished slavery in all French colonies. This was a first hint of victory, though Napoleon later reimposed slavery in 1802, except in Saint-Domingue, where the ex-slaves would not be re-enslaved. Toussaint Louverture emerged as a skilled leader, and by 1801 had control of the colony, though under nominal French authority. When Napoleon sent a huge expedition in 1802 to retake the island and re-enslave its people, the black population fought ferociously. They suffered immense losses, and Toussaint himself was captured and sent to France to die in a prison. But under Dessalines, the struggle continued. Finally, in late 1803, the French forces, decimated by yellow fever and relentless guerrilla attacks, surrendered. On the 1st of January, 1804, Dessalines declared the independence of Haiti, the indigenous name of the land. Haiti thus became the first country to abolish slavery, following the colony of Saint-Domingue's independence, and the world's first and oldest free black-led republic. It was the only black nation to free itself from European rule in that era. It was a stunning achievement. An enslaved population had defeated one of the strongest military powers on earth and abolished slavery on their soil forever. The Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves through the Caribbean. For enslaved people elsewhere, it was a beacon of hope, proof that freedom could be seized. For planters and colonial governments, it was the ultimate nightmare. They tightened security, brutally quashed any sign of copycat uprisings, and in some cases even banned the news of Haiti from reaching slaves, though news traveled regardless. Haiti also had a direct influence on emancipation. It forced European powers to reconsider the costs of trying to maintain slavery by force against people willing to die for freedom. Abolition movements. Back in Europe, especially Britain, the late 18th and early 19th centuries saw the rise of organized abolitionist movements. Humanitarians, former slaves like Olaudah Equiano, and religious groups, Quakers, evangelicals, campaigned vigorously against the slave trade and then slavery itself. They publicized the horrors of the Middle Passage and the plantations. They organized boycotts of sugar produced by slaves. Over decades, public opinion shifted. Politicians like William Wilberforce championed the cause in Parliament. The efforts bore fruit. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, meaning no new slaves could be imported, though smuggling continued somewhat. Other nations followed the U.S. also banned importation in 1808. France, in theory, in 1815, though enforcement lagged. Abolition of the trade, increased slaveholders' incentives to treat the enslaved slightly better to preserve the existing population, but conditions were still terrible in many places. The abolitionists kept pushing for the end of slavery itself. In the British Empire, matters came to a head in the 1832. The major 1831 slave rebellion in Jamaica, Baptist War, alarmed the British public and government. Many concluded that slavery was untenable and immoral. Finally, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed in 1833, decreeing the end of slavery in most British colonies from 1834. The law included an apprenticeship system requiring ex-slaves to work for their masters for a few more years, ostensibly to smooth the transition, and indeed to appease planters by extracting some additional labor. However, this apprenticeship was met with protests in the Caribbean. Notably, in Trinidad, at the dawn of emancipation on the 1st of August 1834, a group of freed people began chanting, "Pas de 6 ans, point de 6 ans, not 6 years, no 6 years," to reject the planned 6-year apprenticeship term. Their peaceful resistance, along with similar movements in other colonies, led the British government to terminate the apprenticeship early. By 1838, full emancipation was granted across the British West Indies. Planters were compensated financially by the government, a hefty sum of £20 million across the empire, but the freed people received no reparations and often had to negotiate harsh economic conditions afterwards. Still, they were no longer someone's property. They could not be flogged by law or sold away from their families. This was a monumental change achieved without a full-scale war, unlike Haiti, though it was undeniably hastened by the persistent threat of slave rebellion and the decades of abolitionist advocacy. France, after the false start in 1794, finally abolished slavery in 1848, when a new revolutionary government decreed freedom in all French colonies. This included Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, Réunion, and other possessions. In some places, like Martinique, enslaved people themselves took direct action to speed this process. News of the Paris Decree traveled slowly, and impatient slaves in Martinique revolted in May 1848, forcing local authorities to emancipate them before the official orders arrived. Denmark had earlier ended slavery in its Caribbean colonies. The 1848 action in Danish Virgin Islands also followed a slave protest. The Dutch abolished slavery in Suriname and their islands in 1863. Spain held on longer in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but pressure and repeated slave rebellions and wars of independence in Cuba eventually led to abolition in Puerto Rico in 1873 and Cuba in 1886. The final end of New World slavery came in Brazil in 1888. Thus, by the end of the 19th century, the brutal system that had reigned for over 300 years in the Caribbean was gone. Freedom was finally enshrined in law. The formerly enslaved faced new struggles: poverty, racism, the need to build communities as free citizens. But the chains of chattel slavery were broken. For those who had survived to see emancipation, it was a profound moment. Imagine an elderly person who had been born into slavery, who had toiled their whole life on a sugar plantation, who had seen their family members sold or killed, now hearing the words of an official proclamation, "You are free." First-hand accounts describe spontaneous celebrations, people weeping, praying, singing hymns of thanksgiving, embracing each other. In some places, ex-slaves staged mock funerals for slavery, burying whips and chains, or burning effigies of a slave driver, symbolizing that the old era was truly dead. It is worth noting that even after official emancipation, life was far from easy for the freed people. Many had to continue laboring on plantations as hired workers because they had no land of their own and few options. Colonial governments often put measures in place to coerce them into staying as a workforce, like high land taxes or vagrancy laws. The legacy of exploitation did not vanish overnight, but one fundamental change could never be undone. These men and women could no longer be bought or sold, punished at will, or denied their basic humanity under the law. They had regained ownership of themselves, which is the cornerstone of human dignity. From the perspective of our narrative, the fight against slavery, whether through rebellion or political action, demonstrates something crucial. Enslaved people did not meekly accept their fate. They resisted in ways large and small, year after year, generation after generation. Their endurance and defiance were ultimately rewarded with freedom, albeit much later than it ever should have taken. The phrase, "you wouldn't last a day," thus has an important counterpoint. Many enslaved Africans and their descendants did last not just a day, but years and decades, and in doing so they laid the groundwork for liberation. Their suffering was immense, but so was their courage. As you drift to sleep after hearing this saga, for this was written in a calm, almost lullaby-like tone, despite the grim content, perhaps you will carry with you some images: the long rows of cane glistening in a harsh sun, a lone figure chopping relentlessly at the horse stalks, the echo of a whip crack across a valley, a small cabin at night where a mother softly sings to her child, hands blistered but gently rocking the little one, the distant drums of a maroon camp in the hills beating in defiance, and the triumphant cries of joy on Emancipation Day as chains were finally cast off. These images tell a story of immense suffering, but also of survival and eventual liberation. Chapter 10. Reflections. You wouldn't last a day. We have now walked through, step by step, the harsh reality of life on a colonial Caribbean sugar plantation. It is a journey that has taken us from the grey light of dawn in the slave quarters to the blistering noon in the cane fields, through the midnight toil of the boiling house, and into the shadow of the whipping post. We have seen bodies bent double under the sun and spirits tested to the breaking point. We have also witnessed the flickers of hope and resistance that survived against all odds. At this point, the meaning of the phrase, "you wouldn't last a day in a colonial Caribbean plantation," should be starkly clear. The average person accustomed to the comforts and rights of modern life could barely imagine lasting even a few hours in those conditions. The unbearable heat alone would overwhelm many of us. Picture yourself in heavy, humid air with the tropical sun hammering down on your head. No sunscreen, no ample water breaks, wearing coarse clothes soaked with sweat and being forced to keep working without pause. Most of us would collapse from heat exhaustion long before noon. Yet the enslaved had to endure that heat day after day, year after year, with no choice in the matter. Then consider the grueling labor, cutting thick cane stalks with a machete from sunrise to sunset, or digging 100 large holes in hard earth by hand, or lifting and carrying 80-pound baskets of manure, or feeding a mill's rollers without pause. Imagine the blisters on your palms, the ache in your lower back, the sting of cane leaves slicing your skin. How long could you swing a hoe or machete under such conditions? An hour? 2? And if you slowed down, there was the whip, an overseer ready to motivate you with pain. The labor was not only physically taxing to the extreme, it was done under constant psychological pressure and threat. Most of us, unaccustomed to any such treatment, might break down weeping or rebel within the first day. But the enslaved could not simply drop their tools and refuse. They had to suppress their anger and exhaustion and continue on, or face lethal punishment. Speaking of punishment, contemplate the harsh discipline and cruelty that were a routine part of plantation life. In our modern lives, the idea of being struck with a bullwhip for not meeting a quota or for taking a moment's rest is unthinkable. It would be a shocking assault. On the plantation, it was common, even a strong-willed person from today's world, if suddenly subjected to a brutal flogging, say 20 lashes that cut flesh and draw blood, might be psychologically traumatized beyond function. The pain, humiliation, and fear that enslaved people endured as a matter of course is something you wouldn't last a day under emotionally, let alone physically. The plantation slaves had to steel themselves to watch family members or friends be whipped, to live knowing any slip could bring terrible punishment. That kind of chronic fear and stress would break most of us rapidly. Many slaves certainly did suffer lasting trauma. Some tried to escape that horror through suicide or other desperate means, as we saw. It is not because modern people are weaker that we might not last. It is because no human being should ever have to tolerate such abuse. Those who survived it did so at great cost to their bodies and psyches, and their endurance is beyond what anyone should be asked to bear. Consider also the devastating impact on health and life expectancy. If you somehow pushed through the heat, the labor, and the punishments for one day, what about a week, a month? You would find your body quickly deteriorating. In the span of just a few days, you might develop festering blisters, sunburn or heat rash, fevers from infected cuts, and sheer muscle exhaustion. Given a few months, you might contract dysentery from the bad water or malnutrition. You would certainly lose weight on the meager rations. Within a year or two, the odds are alarmingly high that you would succumb to one of the many dangers, maybe a work accident, like getting caught in a mill, or a tropical disease. Recall that in some colonies, an enslaved person's average lifespan after arriving was only 7 to 9 years. Put bluntly, the plantation system chewed people up and spit them out. Enslaved individuals started young and strong, but the system aged and broke them with terrifying speed. So indeed, not only would you likely not last a single day without collapsing, but even if you did manage to survive that first day, the cumulative effect of many such days would almost certainly kill you in short order. It took a combination of extraordinary endurance, adaptation, and unfortunately, sometimes sheer luck or divine providence, as some believed, to survive long in that environment. The people who did survive for years under those conditions were, in a sense, forced to become superhuman in endurance. And even then, as we've noted, many perished prematurely despite their strength. It is also crucial to realize that saying, "you wouldn't last a day," is not meant to diminish the enslaved or suggest they had some magic immunity to suffering. On the contrary, they felt every lash, every ache, every grief deeply. They survived, not because it was easy for them, but because they often had no other choice, and because human beings can endure incredible hardship when pushed, though at great physical and emotional cost. The difference is that they were born, or brought into a system that brutalized them from the start, so they adapted as best they could. A modern person parachuting into that world would lack even the minimal conditioning and communal knowledge that enslaved people accumulated to cope. We would be, quite literally, out of our element in a hellish scenario, overwhelmed on multiple fronts: environmental, physical, emotional. So yes, you or I wouldn't last a day in those slave plantations is a humbling truth. It compels us to respect and acknowledge the sheer resilience of those who did live that life. To say we couldn't do it is not to imply we are weak. It is to underscore how extraordinarily strong the enslaved had to be simply to survive. Each day they lasted was an act of quiet heroism, a refusal to die, a refusal to let torment completely crush the last vestiges of their humanity. In our calm retelling, we have maintained a measured tone, but let there be no mistake about the horror that underlay everything we've described. Sometimes, a calm recounting can even sharpen the impact by removing any sensationalism and sticking to facts. The facts themselves are shocking enough. And behind those facts were real people, men named Kwame or John, women named Abena or Mary, who woke before dawn with heavy hearts, worked themselves to exhaustion under threat of violence, loved their children even though they might be sold tomorrow, whispered songs of hope at night, and did it all again the next day. Many died anonymous, buried in unmarked graves on the plantation, or at sea during transport. They had no monuments in their time. Now, however, we have the opportunity and obligation to remember and honor them. Every discussion like this one, every history book, every preserved plantation site or memorial is a testament to what they endured and a warning from the past. It teaches us about the depths of cruelty humans can inflict, and equally about the heights of endurance and courage the human spirit can reach. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine in the distance the faint sound of a conch horn at dawn and the low humming of an old work song. We end in the quiet hush of remembrance. In the stillness of our imagination, we might picture standing on the grounds of a former sugar estate today, the crumbling stone windmill, silhouetted against the evening sky, a warm breeze rustling through wild cane grass. In that tranquil scene, we remember the countless footsteps that once trod this soil in bondage. The sun may set gently now on these fields, but it sets on a history that was harsh. We hear, perhaps, an echo of their songs in the wind and feel the weight of their absence. Such reflection gently bridges the past and present, assuring that those who suffered and persevered are not forgotten. Now night has fallen in our story, just as it did each day on those plantations. We honor the voices of those who suffered, the ones who sang in the dark to keep hope alive. We also give thanks that we live in a time and circumstance where we are free, and let that gratitude guide us to empathize with those who were not so fortunate. The phrase, "you wouldn't last a day," is not just a caution of our own fragility, but a tribute to their strength, a strength we hope never again needs to be called upon under such conditions. Truly, those who endured even a single day in that world earned a place of honor in human history. Each dawn we experience in our lives is gentler than the ones that broke over the cane fields 2 centuries ago. As we imagine the world of those plantations and then return to the safety of our own beds, we carry with us the memory of countless souls who endured beyond what any person should. Their resilience lights a beacon, reminding us of the value of freedom and justice. And so, under the canopy of night, our journey ends, and we let those souls sleep in peace. With that, we bid a gentle good night to those souls, and rest, knowing their story is not forgotten. Good night.